Dr. Josh Sanchez, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Going on, Brad? Pretty good. How are you?
I am doing well. Yeah, looking forward to the conversation. We're diving into a lot of muscles and tendons today. And then we're going to also chat a little bit about your story. You've had a crazy last 6 months. So probably park the conversation there a bit too, if that's cool with you.
Yeah. I've been hurt for a while and it's been ups and downs. So we can talk about, the return. So,
but you're on the up and up.
On the up and up. Yeah. Slowly but surely.
Yeah. So good time to talk to you about the up and up. Before we do that, can you give us a quick background on who you are and your story?
Yeah. My name is Josh Sanchez. I am a sports chiropractor and strength and conditioning specialist. Just briefly, I grew up in Florida. I went to Florida, hence the Gators. I don't know what side it's on. And then when I graduated chiropractic college, I wanted to come out west for, running and stuff like that because Oregon's a big mecca. Came out west. And then just pretty much from 2017 to now, just to keep it short, got into the running space in terms of healthcare and stuff like that. Training myself, running competitively, running with Bowerman Track Club Elite. I did spend about a year and a half out in Boulder, Colorado, with Brad and Ryan over at Lever, helping promote, the Lever product and trying to run my own practice out of there. And then came back here. So I'm back in the Beaverton area.
Yeah. Does it feel like a home?
It does. Yeah. So, I mean, I loved Colorado in terms of I do miss the hiking and the mountains and stuff like that. I don't know. Each has its own perks and drawbacks, right? I mean, it rains here all the time, but obviously we don't have the altitude benefit, and hiking is pretty good here too, but it's not crazy where it's yeah, I can go climb a 14er or something like that and be hardcore about it in Colorado. So.
Okay, then I have to ask, what is, in your opinion, the better place to run and train?
The better place to run and train? Depends on what phase of training and what aspect. I mean, I would probably say, I don't know. I would probably say,
Josh.
Yeah. Okay. I would probably say Colorado, to be honest.
Colorado.
Yeah. Okay. Boulder, you got your peaks and valleys, you got your hills, although I would say Boulder is relatively flat. I just feel like, Oregon, at least where I'm at, it's pretty hilly. You can also find flat spots too, in terms of hills. But I mean, in Colorado, you got the altitude benefit. It's sunny 300 days of the year. Although I heard you guys got a pretty bad winter this past time around, and maybe the last past time around. So I'm sure it's a pain in the butt, when it's winter time trying to fit in workouts and stuff, and you're stuck on the treadmill for 1 or 2 weeks at a time, depending. But other than that, yeah, I mean, I'm going out to Colorado for a little bit in the summer, so I'm looking forward to the mountains and the hills and stuff like that. So,
good answer.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
That's great. No, that sounds good. And today's conversation, like I said, we're jumping into more of the medical side of things with you. But before we do that, we ask a question to all of our guests, and the question is, what is the why behind why you run?
What is the why? So, I mean, health, fitness, for lack of a better term, I feel like it's become my identity as growing up. I don't know if you felt the same way. But in terms of team sport growing up, I'm not a big guy or stuff like that. So I figured I'd probably excel at the individual sports. And so I picked up running as a sport and I grew in love with it, from middle school all the way to now. And it's something that's very quantifiable. It's you put in X amount of work, you usually get Y amount of outcome, right? So it's not and also, I mean, it's it's obviously not a team sport. So that if you overdo the training or if you get hurt or if you probably understand that more as you get older and you become more humble, because when you're younger, you're kind of very stubborn and you just want to get into it. And no matter what happens, because that's what happens when it comes to the sport. But yeah, the why of running is pretty much for the health aspect, the enjoyment, the endorphins, just being outside, especially this time of year, running and enjoying the sun and, so.
Yeah, no, I love it. All good things. I think for me right now too, I mean, it's middle of May when we're recording this podcast and the sun's finally coming out, I feel like. So our spring and our winter just felt like it lasted forever. So now we can get outside and the sun's warm again, which is exciting. But yeah, no, like I said, we're jumping into the medical side of things. You had a really good post a few days back it honestly piqued my interest and my curiosity, and wanted to chat more about it. And you had a strength for runners post, and
Hmm.
it was going through a few of the large muscle and tendon groups, and then also like the ratios and different like strength, um, strength exercises to kind of go to strengthen those different muscle groups. So wanted
Yeah.
to jump into it. Obviously, the first one, give an overview first. We're going to be talking through like the lumbar, the hip, quads and hamstrings, and then ankle as well,
Yeah.
which
Yep.
ankle's not a muscle or tendon. This is a bone. But we can
Yeah.
talk
Same
through
point.
the tendon side of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, just kind of give us an overview of that post, and what you were getting at. I'd love to start there.
So, like you mentioned prior, I've been hurt for like 6 months. And so it's kind of like when you become hurt as a healthcare professional, you can obsess over it in the terms of like, why did this happen and stuff. And so I started delving into really deep into like kind of like strength training and conditioning. I'm still going down that rabbit hole. And I've done some work with a company. This podcast is not sponsored, called Melloc. They're based out of Sweden, I believe. And basically, they have a dynamometer that tells you peak force, time to peak force, and average force for each contraction that you do. And then did some reading. A book I like to read, I read over and over and over. It's called Running Mechanics and Gait Analysis by MacDonald and Ferber. So if you want a good understanding or a better understanding of like kind of like biomechanics and the angles of what happens during running, like when your foot's on the ground and stuff like that, it's a great book. So talking about the ratios now, so pulling up those numbers for a couple of things, it depends on the speed of the contraction because it if you're contracting too fast, you're probably going to have a higher ratio. For example, like if you're testing your quad to your hamstring, and if you want maybe 50 to 80%, like you have to go down a rabbit hole to look up research. Like not everything is like super definitive to like distance runners, but it's kind of like a ballpark and you make like a clinical judgment. So 50 to 80% or so. And if it's like less than that, then you're going to have a problem because basically muscles kind of work like, opposing muscles to help stabilize a joint. So if you're throwing a baseball, the muscles as the arm comes forward, you have agonist muscles that help bring the arm forward, and you have antagonist muscles that slow down the pitch. So like there's a ratio of like these got to be strong to slow down when you throw a pitch, and these got to be strong to be able to throw the pitch, right? Because if these are weak and these are over strong, then you're more likely to hurt yourself because that's more of a what they call like an eccentric or negative portion, hurt the tendons and like the rotator cuff and stuff like that. And so I originally had quadricep tendonitis on my left side, and I got that Millock device, and I did a post on Instagram about it. It also depends on the angle of how you measure, so take it with a grain of salt. I don't have one of those really super expensive, isometric machines, whatever, to chest, quad strength. That ratio was like 20%, 30%. So I was like, oh, okay, that's probably why the loading of that knee happened and why I ended up with a bad strain of quadricep tendonitis to begin with. So,
If you can, just kind of give me the visual of that, right? So it's supposed to be at like 50 to 80%
yeah,
quad to
around 50
hamstring.
to 80%.
Yeah. So what does that actually look like? What does the test look like?
So basically, I set up the dynamometer on like a cable machine that has a seat, and I warm up. So basically, what I do is I tell either me or the patient and the athlete, we do 50% effort, relative effort of just like pushing into the dynamometer for 5 seconds. Then we take a 2 to 3 minute break. Then we go 75% of pushing into the dynamometer, 2 to 3 minute break, and then we do 2 attempts of full force, ramp up kind of thing. So basically, they hold on to the sides and they extend their knee. They kick into the dynamometer. Obviously, it's not going to move, so that it's going to measure and it's going to beep too of like how much force is being put in there and the time to peak force. And that's the average. Did I say that already? Yeah, the time to peak force and how long it took to get there. And then we take a 3 minute break and we do it again. And we take that highest number and we measure in newtons. So it's just a measurement of like, force, Sir Isaac Newton. And then we do that twice on each leg. And then as far as the hamstrings, like I said, we don't have any of the fancy machines. We have to do what we can do and try to isolate the hamstring. I put them face down on the floor. And then I set the face down on the floor, dynamometer kind of like anchored to like a squat rack pole, and they're on their stomach. And basically, it's the same warm up protocol, and they contract, as hard as they can around mid range or so to see what kind of force production they get. Again, measured in newtons. And then we take the ratio, and then it's like, oh crap, so this is good or this is bad. Or if a patient comes in and they're complaining of like knee pain, or anterior knee pain is pretty common with the hamstring weakness. We can talk about that as we go through each one. And yeah, so it's a quantifiable measure. And there's other things you can do too. I'll do more posts on Instagram about it, but yeah.
Okay, so to break it down simple for a guy like me. So sitting on a chair, for the quad one, you're kicking your foot out right in front of you.
Yep.
And that's how you measure that
to an immovable object. Yeah.
And then when you're measuring your hamstring, you're laying on the ground, and it's essentially your heel to your glute.
Yep.
And so then the ratio aspect, you said it was 20% for yours.
Yeah.
And that is quad
or hamstring to quad.
Hamstring to quad.
Yeah.
Is 20% of your quad strength.
Yes.
Okay. And it should be 50 to 80.
50 to 80, yeah.
Is the range. Okay.
Yeah.
So what did that tell you, that test right there?
That my hamstrings are weak AF. So that tells me that, like, from a running standpoint, I know we're going to talk about all of them, but we kind of just jump straight to the quad one. Because I mean, if your audience is primarily runners, and that's probably like everyone talks about knee pain, knee is about 40% of most running injuries. Like half the injuries runners get is from the knee. So it's definitely relative. So that told me that when my foot hits the ground, both the quads and the hamstrings are working to control that knee. The hamstring works in conjunction with the ACL, that ligament that's deep in the knee, to slow down. So pretend this is your tibia. I don't know. Yeah, there we go. So it's supposed to slow down the lower leg from like sliding forward when the foot hits the ground, and it works with the hamstrings. So if the hamstrings are weak, the quads are always going to be stronger than the hamstrings no matter what. But if the ratio is off, you're more likely to have a poor extension, meaning like when you push off to run, extending the hip, it's going to be weaker. You're going to have a harder time flexing the knee, right? Like when you see people kick their butt when they run, which is going to affect how you can attenuate force and how you will be able to swing that leg through, the gait cycle and get that foot back down. It also shows that when the foot swings forward in the gait cycle while it's still in the air, like before it hits the ground, the hamstring is supposed to slow down eccentrically or negatively, meaning that it's contracting at the same time that the muscle is lengthening before it hits the ground to slow down that impact, right? And so since I have that issue, that tells me that my leg is probably spending more time in the air, both from a back point and a front point, that I'm probably slapping the ground much harder, right? Because I can't slow down the swing in the back, and I can't attenuate enough force efficiently to be able to bend it, a good enough degrees while I swing that knee forward. And then so mechanically, by way of load, injuries happen when you have stress and frequency, right? And if you have too much stress and too much frequency, stress being like the intensity of the exercise, and frequency being like the amount of steps or how often you're doing it. If those are too high, both, you can look at each structure in your body individually. That will put you in the increase in injury zone. So you could say because of that, and I've done other posts too on like looking at my biomechanics through another app called Yager, which uses AI, not sponsored, but uses AI to show like the dynamic angles of the runner, if you can get them on a treadmill or, record while they're running. And you can quantify that too and see that as well, along with the strength stuff and along with like a movement assessment. So I went down that rabbit hole. It's like, oh crap. So my, quads and hamstring ratio, or hamstring to quadricep ratio, is off. My hamstrings are weak. I need to fix this, even though like I'm healing and I don't have pain. You don't have to have dysfunction, like trouble moving, to have pain, and vice versa. So like what I like to do is, if someone comes in, and now with myself is like, if I know if I have a movement pattern problem, I want to be able to figure out what that movement pattern problem is as quick as possible and try to correct it before I start, overloading the area by virtue of mechanics, hitting that area, loading more force into that area to have an issue. But yeah.
Yeah. So just to kind of recap a little bit, because this is really good information. And I think a lot of people, especially runners, probably also deal with weaker hamstrings.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't realize it until an injury pops up, or you do something that's abnormal, and you realize how weak your hamstrings are. I can give you mine actually real quick.
Yeah.
When I realized my hamstrings were extremely weak is when I was doing good mornings, like that exercise, good mornings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, yeah. So did that exercise and with like 10 pounds, like no weight at all. And I couldn't even walk for 3 days. And that's when I knew my hamstrings were just,
Yeah.
yeah,
super weak.
yeah. So it really, really poor, but I think this is a really good conversation. So when your hamstrings are weak, it's essentially your whole back swing of your foot is, you said it's too long. And then is there also an overstriding component to it as well?
Yes. In the sense of, so if you have weak hamstrings, and we can talk about the quads too. Let me just mention the quads real briefly. When the foot hits the ground, within the first 20% of like when your foot hits the ground of stance, your quads and your glutes are supposed to like keep that knee, from like really, really falling. And the hamstrings work too. So that's where like, just don't forget about the quads. I'm sorry, what was your question again about the
overstriding?
Yeah. Okay. So what's going to happen is that if the hamstrings are weak, you're probably going to see an increase in like turnover in the sense of like, because you can't kick your butt as high, right? So you're going to want to get back to the ground as quick as possible. But at the same time, when the leg swings forward, like we mentioned prior, the knee extends and then hits the ground. If it's weak eccentrically, it's going to extend longer relative to as the leg is swinging. So therefore, you're probably going to land more in front of your center of mass. And by the way, you can't run underneath your center of mass. It's like physically impossible. So that's like a misnomer. You can get pretty close. But the only way you can get close is if you were sprinting. And then if you were to get your foot underneath your center of mass, you would eventually fall over. So the misnomer of like, the cue, it's a good cue to tell a runner, run underneath your center of mass, but you can't really run underneath your center of mass. You can run pretty close to it.
Debunked.
So, yeah.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Heard it here first. So yeah, the leg is going to swing out. It's going to be out there longer, for lack of a better term. And have you ever had shin splints, like anterior front shin pain, like, in the front of your lower legs?
You're taking me back to my middle school days, but yes.
Okay. So I worked a lot with runners and occasionally may find something different, but for probably just making up a percentage, probably like 85% of the time, whoever walks into the office that has anterior shin pain almost always has, this is anecdotal, almost always has weak hamstrings, because the tibialis anterior, that front shin muscle, when it hits the ground, when the foot hits the ground, I wish I had like a little model here, but I don't. When the foot hits the ground, that muscle is supposed to like absorb the shock and keep it from slapping the ground too fast. If your hamstring is weak, if you think about it, you're going to be way out in front. And so that means your arc, the amount of time and amount of tension and load that tendon and muscle complex take is going to be longer and experience potentially more force. So you're more likely to have anterior shin splints with having weak hamstrings, is what I see a lot in clinical practice. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so now that we're on the injury conversation, maybe this is a good, before we move any further, just like a good time to talk about this one specifically, quad and hamstrings. When you see a 20% ratio that is not healthy, what other injuries do pop up? So anecdotally, shin splints. And then what are some of the other injuries that are common because of like a ratio like that?
So anterior knee pain in front of the knee, runner's knee, patellofemoral pain syndrome. We still, as of 2020, because I'm working on a post on this, is that we don't really know what causes patellofemoral pain syndrome. Runner's knee is a combination of that and IT band syndrome. But because of the shear effect, and we can also talk about the foot, maybe another podcast or whatever, the amount of time the foot's on the ground, the amount of pronation that's happening, and the amount of when the knee is supposed to extend relative to the tibia, the lower leg, during stance and push off, is going to affect how that knee happens, right? So you got to look at the whole picture. So in a nutshell, hamstrings are weak, comes forward. You're going to spend probably more time on the ground, more force is going to be loaded into your tissues, and it's going to cause like the kneecap to kind of go out of place, go to the side. At least that's a potential mechanism of what happens when you push off to get runner's knee. Hamstring weakness could definitely be a problem. Second is IT band syndrome, also known as I was going to say IT band friction syndrome, but now I'm having a brain fart. So maybe I'll come back to that. But just in general, IT band syndrome. It's common to experience pain within the first 20 to 30 degrees of knee flexion of when the foot hits the ground on the knee. Like people have IT band pain at that, what they call neurovascular bundle at the femur, that big leg bone down at the knee. If you can't control both extension or be strong by way of hamstrings or glutes and quads, obviously, and your calves, or relative motion of how the hamstrings are slowing down and the quads slowing down that knee motion, then there's going to be a disconnect and there's going to be an overload into the IT band. You can also go, I know people are going to be like, it's more than just that. It is more than just that. There's a lot of stuff out there, talking about the hip strength and mobility is probably more important than the foot strength when it comes to IT band syndrome. So going down that rabbit hole, we can also talk about the hip strength and stuff like that for IT band syndrome, but it's still considered an anterior knee pain problem. Another one is patellar tendonitis, which is more common in your adolescent athletes, your tendon that's below your kneecap. For me, it was the quad tendon. We can talk about that too, which is the tendon right attaches to the kneecap, the quad portion. As if there's a greater, hamstring or lesser hamstring to quadricep strength ratio is going to be that more of that anterior translation, that translation of the knee going forward, the tibia sliding forward. You're going to load that tendon misjunction a lot more, right? You can't control that force that's going down into that area efficiently. So eventually something is going to have to break or give, right? And it's usually, the tendon. So that's another issue that can happen from that standpoint. Shin splints from anecdotally, which you already mentioned. And then you can even go further down the chain. Like if you take someone clinically and you look at all their range of motion, you look at their midfoot, their rear foot, how much their tibia is rotating inward because that's needed. Like if you find that, it's not as black and white as people want when it comes to injuries. There's a lot of influencers that post, here's an exercise for this kind of thing. But you have to look at everything from the ground up to see like, does this area need to be strengthened or does this area need to be mobilized? And even if a patient or athlete has, anterior knee pain, doesn't necessarily mean that they have weak hamstrings or quadriceps. They could have the hamstring quadricep ratio, but they could still have knee pain. We just got to figure out where it's coming from. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So, okay. So if I heard you correctly, so IT band syndrome,
IT band syndrome,
shin splints, runner's knee, and then patellar tendonitis, which is that jumper's knee?
Jumper's knee. Yeah. Runner's knee. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Jumper's knee. Yeah.
Did I miss any of them or is that?
I think that's it. Quad tendonitis, which is kind of almost the same thing, but
quad tendonitis. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, that's really interesting. And I think by trying to go through all four of these, we may have bit off more than we can chew. So let's just hang out here for a bit longer.
Okay.
On quads and hamstrings.
Yeah.
And we'll have you back on to talk about the other ones because there's a lot of good information here. And I think a lot of good takeaways for people.
Yeah.
First and foremost, I'd love to know, is the only way to measure your ratio by having a device like you mentioned?
So obviously devices can be expensive. It's nice to have in terms of quantifiableness and, anecdotally ballpark, like, is this athlete missing on power or strength? Like you can figure out like if a athlete is strong powerfully or can they really utilize that strength to put into power, the amount of work they can do over time. For a majority of the time, especially like getting out of school or if you're a coach or something, you can test it like with just your hands, right? Like you can have the patient or athlete go face down and pull on their hamstring and see, which I do in the office, just like as an initial, because like if I can overpower you in a position that's not dynamic to the sport that you're specific in, that's a problem. Like I don't even have to measure really where you are, right? So you don't necessarily need it. You can figure out like from that standpoint, but again, keep in mind the movement has to be specific as close as possible to the sport at hand that you're trying to train or perform your best in. So I can, like, for example, I had a patient that came in that was dealing with, they've been doing clamshells for their glute medius to get stronger because whoever they saw told them that their glute medius are weak. So the glute medius is a hip stabilizer. We can also go down a rabbit hole with that muscle at another podcast because it's an interesting muscle. But just because they get stronger at the clamshells, and then I take them to do hip hikes or have them stand on one leg, doesn't necessarily mean that's going to translate over to the sport, right? So they can do clamshells all day and get strong at that. But when they do hip hikes, which is a single leg stance that you're standing up and you're using one leg and using only that muscle on the side of the hip to push the ball or towel into the wall to contract, they're weak at that standpoint. So I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent. You don't have to have a dynamometer. You can use your hands, but take it with a grain of salt to, like, what you're feeling as a clinician and your experience of working with, athletes, depending on the sport. So
is there any research out there that talks to, averages as far as like the percentage of runners that have like weak hamstrings, essentially, like like poor ratios from a quad to hamstring?
So when I was making that post, I did the best I could to find something that would be close to running either. So you can click on like the PubMed articles that I cited in that post. And I would say for distance running, there isn't really a lot of normative data, right? You have to look at the normative data of the fancy, machines that are out there. You've probably seen like football players and baseball players, on Instagram, of pushing really hard into that isokinetic machine to measure force. But there isn't much normative data, I would say, for like distance runners. And if there is, it's very small sample size, like 10 to 20 people maybe. So it's more of a, like, there needs to be more research done. There has to be more normative data depending on the equipment they're doing, better reliability and validity. So like, make sure all the angles are the same. Make sure, the ramp up time is the same. Make sure the recovery time is the same. Stuff like that, the methods. So at least right now with what I'm doing with the dynamometer, it's more of like, I want to collect data. Like, as patients come in, maybe I should start collecting data on what injuries they have, which would be kind of cool. But there isn't really much data, in my opinion, unless I haven't really found anything yet. Normative data, that is, when it comes to hamstring this quadricep strength ratio. But there is normative data. You can go open the Essentials of Strength Training Conditioning textbook, and one of the chapters has, like, depending on the sport, if they're in the 50 percentile, this is how strong, like, their power clean or back squat or deadlift should be, kind of thing. And then you have to go down another rabbit hole to see if there's any normative data on that 50 percentile in terms of like relative injury risk and stuff like that. So for absolute, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's all good points to make. I would also love to just chat for a minute here around, again, we named the 4 injuries: ITBS, shin splints, runner's knee, jumper's knee.
Yeah.
To use the common terms. And we already talked about, there's not a common like strength exercise that fits all, but could you give us a good idea of like a few solid hamstring exercises that, runners can do, and that will, if they're at the 20 percentile as well, ratio wise, get them closer to that 50? Like, what have you been working on to bring your ratio back to normal levels?
So I do single leg RDLs. I actually got pretty good at them, like 135 pounds on a single leg with,
That's more than my 10 pounds.
Yeah. Yeah. But the funny thing is the hamstring, remember, it crosses the knee joint. And remember, you also have to train dynamically depending on what the sport is needed. So like, I could single leg RDL. So I recommend RDLs to target the proximal portion of the hamstring, or the hamstring that's closest to the center of your body, up in your buttock. But then I realized that the motion, you remember the motion we talked about earlier of the leg swinging out to slow down before it hits the ground? Mm-hmm. That was really weak on me. Like, when I found out that my hamstrings were weak, I started doing like the hamstring curl machine, face down. And I'm just like, I could hardly do 15, 20 pounds, but I can single leg RDL 135. So that tells me, and I have strained my hamstrings twice, by the way, usually doing like 400s or 200s, which makes sense because I can't slow down. Right. Yeah. There's also other data out there. I heard, about like your force of your hamstrings. I know I'm going off on a tangent, but here's some good information, and you might have to go down a rabbit hole to find more about it because I need to still. 240 to about 350 newtons for sprinters. Their hamstring strength has to be right in order to have a lower relative injury risk reduction when it comes to like sprinting. So it would make sense that if you're running faster and your hamstrings are weak because they're needed for running in general, especially for sprinting, that you're more likely to hurt it. So get back on track. Single leg RDL, hamstring curls, either the hamstring machine, bands, or cable machine. And there's stuff out there on Nordic hamstring curls is doing a really good job because they target like the eccentric portion. I should do more of those, to be honest. But Nordics you'll probably find a lot more information on Nordic hamstring exercises than you probably would of the other two. And so I'm sure you've seen those, right? It's like
I'm actually not familiar with the Nordic hamstring.
Okay. So what you do is that you find a piece of furniture or like a piece in the gym that you can like get on your knees, you're on your knees, and you lock your heels so they don't move. And so you're kind of like sideways as your lower, knee is flat, lower leg is flat, parallel to the ground. And then basically you slowly lower yourself eccentrically to the point where like you give up, and then you go back up and you do it again. So that's a good one. There are variations. If that's hard for you, you can actually add a band around your waist or upper body and anchor it to like a squat rack while you have your feet anchored on like, I don't know, you put a barbell on the ground so that you can actually gradually load over time the amount of eccentric load you have, going forward without the fear of falling. Eventually, you get so good at it, like you probably see some influencers online that can go all the way to the ground and come all the way back up. But it's
without anything holding their ankles.
Well, no, they need something holding their ankles. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, because that'd be really impressive balance wise. Okay. See, I've seen that. Just wasn't familiar with Nordic, but that's another good one. So, any others before?
For the hamstring?
Yeah.
Those are pretty much the main three. I mean, you could do deadlifts, like regular deadlifts, but I feel like that's just not really specific to like running per se. So you could do them if you want. I don't do them. And then I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's just off the top of my head is like really gonna get it pretty good. But I think those are it. Yeah.
Yeah, those are good three for sure to start with, and it sounds like you use those in your return to run plan as well.
And it's working. I'm up to about 55 pounds now, as of like a month of 2 to 3 days a week of lifting for the hamstring curls. Yeah.
Oh, hamstring curls. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and you started at 15.
Yeah, 15, 20, struggling.
Have you retaken the test?
No, I actually probably want to do that pretty soon, probably next week or the week after that. Yeah, to see.
Right.
Yeah.
You'll have to keep us in the loop with that for sure, because that's a very interesting point to me. Is you've been working on this for about 6 months now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would say that the whole hamstring thing was probably relatively recent because, like, you could do all the right things, especially with like if you have a background knowing like biomechanics and stuff like that. But like it just, it bites you in the butt when like you're like, why didn't I catch that in the first place? Kind of thing. So yeah, probably the last 3 months, I've been kind of like trying to focus a little bit more, maybe a little less than that, 2 months or so, focus more on the hamstring, just because of I know what's weak on me kind of thing. And usually if that spot is weak and everything else is so strong for me, whatever there's a weak point for me, it's like eventually will break. So yeah.
Yeah. I'd be very curious where you are at now from 20%. And are you doing like 2 to 3 exercises per week?
Yeah. So 2 to 3 exercise per week, of 2 to 3 sets. Sometimes time can be a problem, but I'm lifting in a specific rep range right now. So like a hypertrophic rep range where I fatigue around 12 reps, right? And then eventually I'll switch to more of a strength type thing. So I'll probably finish this hypertrophic phase that I'm doing for my hamstrings or muscle growth, and then test it and then see if I'm good enough. And then if I am good enough, then I'll go into strength. If I'm almost there, I'll probably do a mixture of hypertrophy and strength, and then eventually just kind of like start transitioning primarily to strength, to get that hamstring stronger kind of thing. But yeah.
What are your reps on the strength phase?
The strength phase, anywhere from 6 to 12 reps at about, so where you fatigue around that rep range, preferably in the upper end, 12, at about 67 to 85% of a 1 rep max for that lift.
Mm.
So you would have to figure out when your 1 rep max is, kind of thing, and go from there. Or you can like plug your fatigue into a calculator and you can figure that out too. Like, oh, I fatigued around 10 reps. So let's plug into a calculator and can tell you your predicted 1 rep max for that lift. But that's pretty much the gist of it. And recovery is anywhere from 30 to 90 seconds, depending of what you're trying to achieve. So
This is all really interesting. And I think if
yeah.
anybody's listening to this podcast that does have some hamstring issues or weak hamstrings, they know have weak hamstrings, definitely something for them to keep an eye on, right? And some exercises to work on. What would be if somebody is in that scenario, what would be your recommendation for them to go do with next steps?
So I would probably find someone that's works with runners or whatever sport you're in, and then really break down your mechanics. Right? We talked about very briefly that it's not just the quads and hand; could be other things too. But like, someone can show you how to do Nordics, or someone that can show you how to do the RDL, because, you need to have the stability before you can actually load up the area. Right. So if you're all over the place and you can't, concentrate that force you want to be, that's why machines are kind of cool, even though some people don't like them because they're not dynamic. But to start with, they're pretty, they're pretty good to start with. Or, just go in the gym, hop on the machine, figure out where your 12 rep max is to start with, and then go from there. So
Great. No, this
yeah.
is good. Really good information. And unfortunately, the quad tendonitis was not the only injury you were dealing with from November. So can you walk
No.
us through the rest of what you've been dealing with for the last few months?
Yeah. So I had that quad tendon that took 3 months to go away, and we can do another podcast. I've been delving down like tendon loading and healing and stuff like that. So it's really interesting. But basically rehab that myself up to about, February. What month is it right now? It's May. Yeah, January, February. And then about 3 weeks in, I jumped in too quick. I went from, after 3 weeks in, from like no running at all, still cross training, towards the end of that 3 month bout with the quad tendonitis, I was using the lever and stuff like that. But I was like, all right, full body weight now, and so I jump up to like 40 minutes on the treadmill within like a week. And I did a workout, with the BTC Elite women. And then after that, it was, it just lit up and it just getting worse and worse. And so I was like, damn it. Stretch fractures don't really show up on x-ray, but, I had pain hopping on one leg. These are like textbook pain hopping on one leg kind of thing, pain right at the mid portion of the bone. Like, I was like, this is, I couldn't reproduce the pain. So without hopping, so I was like, okay, this is definitely probably bone related. I mean, I got an x-ray. They don't really show. They take probably several months, maybe 1 or 2 months to show, or several weeks. So went with the notion that it is a fibular stress fracture. And yeah, so I dealt with that, pretty much cross trained for 6.5 weeks. And then the last, I'm on week 5 of return. I did use the lever 3 to 4 times a week, started all the way down max up to 45 pounds of your body weight. So it started at 65% every other day, 3 to 4 days a week. And then the following week was 70%, go up 5%. And the following week, 75, the following week, 80, 85. And now I'm kind of like alternating. I go run outside, volume. So volume is more important than intensity. When you get back into running, you need to focus on the duration more than like, I need to get back into shape kind of thing. But basically it's been run outside, lever, run outside, lever. Next week will probably be like run, lever, run, lever. Yeah. So, and then the following week I should be back to normal. But yeah, just a gradual load on the bone. You can, there's a lot of cool information out there on like stress fractures. Again, another podcast or something we can talk about another time, of like how much time is needed to load bone, like how much is happening internally. Just as a tidbit, just as a teaser, you hear 3 to 5 times your body weight when you run, but that's not necessarily true. Different muscle groups and different bones. For example, the tibia actually takes 6 to 14 times your body weight internally by the muscles and the structure around there and gravity. So you got someone that has tibial stress fractures, like frequently you see that in high schoolers and college kids a lot. We need to look at the strength, up the chain and see why that, the musculature is affecting, the load in that area for you to start to develop a fatigue, because that's what they are, fatigue fractures. But yeah,
Wow. Okay. So 6 to 15% is a lot higher than 3 to 5.
six, yeah, 6 to
Oh,
14 times internally.
sorry. Yeah.
Okay,
Times, not
yeah,
percent. Yeah.
yeah, and I got that from the podcast, Mountain Land Running Physical Therapy, with Brian Heiderscheit. He's out of University of Wisconsin, but he brought someone on. They talked about stress fractures and stuff like that, and that was in
Wow.
there. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, all good stuff. And sounds like you're well on your way to your own return. Do you have any races coming up? Anything on the calendar?
Well, I'm trying to get my mileage back up. I'm going to look at Stumptown Twilight, the Open 5K, on July 20th. So hopefully I'll be in Colorado for about a month. I'll stop by in Boulder for like a couple days, but I'm working that high school running camp again, team prep for 3 weeks in Gunnison, and I'll head to Boulder for a little bit, and then I'll drive straight back, and then hop into that 5K and see if I can PR or see what kind of shape I'm in. I haven't broken 15 yet. My half marathon says I'm there, but I don't know. Maybe if I fix my hamstring strength, I can actually get the leg speed to go, right? Because you need the hamstring strength for the leg speed. So,
So yeah, you're
yeah,
doing all the right things right now.
yeah. So, but yeah, and then after that, August, I might do half marathon in Philadelphia. I'm thinking about it. Aren't you from Philly?
From Philly.
Yeah. So the Philadelphia distance run is a good one. It's
Mhm.
kind of like, stacked. You probably have like 30 people that run under 70 in the half marathon that enter that. So it's like a giant road long cross country race. It feels like, it's in September, and that's a good one to do. I might do that one. And there's Club Cross in December in Seattle this year. So I'll see if I can hop on either, whatever teams that go, with BTC. And then I want to do a marathon. I just don't know what yet. I mean, I've dropped out my last 3 marathons because of injury, which is kind of unfortunate. I was getting super fit too. Like I was like, I'm ready to run that OTQ or whatever. But yeah, it just wasn't in the cards.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe CIM again. Maybe I'll do a little one. I kind of want to do Eugene next year. If I don't get into London, I entered the lottery for London.
Cool.
But they say like only 8,000 people or 5,000 people international get in, and the race has like 30,000 people. So it's really hard to get into London.
Mhm.
If not, I'll do Eugene. I have and coach online too. I had an athlete from Dallas fly in and run Eugene. I was like, yeah, this is like, Eugene magic, Hayward magic kind of thing. It was a vibe. And I was like, well, it may not be quote unquote, I don't know, don't quote me on it, but the fastest course, but it's just
Mm.
like, you got people running, 220. I think the course record is still like 216 or 215. So it can be done. It's just, Eugene. So it's magic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that I'm definitely taking away from the podcast with you today is, some of the injuries that we come across are like blessings in disguise.
Yeah.
But just by working on the hamstring strength and because of the imbalance and the weakness, like you almost had a ceiling that was above you. But now that you understand what's kind of in your way to bust through that ceiling, you can really work on those things to fastest days are ahead for you, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's all about figuring it out, right? And doing all the things to keep you from getting hurt and to, lower the chance of getting hurt and to improve performance. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Well, great. Well, what's the best way for people to follow along with what you're doing next?
Yeah, so you can follow me on social media. I have 2 Instagram accounts. One is JSanchDC, which is my personal one, JSANCHDC. The other Instagram account is Long Run Health, which is my business I started relatively recently. It's just Long Run Health. I would say I'm trying to make my personal one more personal and more like runner like, and then the health one more, or the business one more health like. I also have a YouTube channel. Which I need to start back up, which I hopefully, it's kind of hard to be a running YouTuber when you can't run and I can't test shoes. I can't, so I can't really I mean, I can, but it's not the same. So I want to start that back up again. That channel on YouTube is called In the Long Run. And yeah, so those are those things there. I don't think I have any other social media. I mean, I have LinkedIn, but I don't know. Yeah.
I think these are great places to start. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
with both of your business name and your Instagram handle, you like long runs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
no,
It's,
obviously
yeah.
deeper meaning to it too, but I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's supposed to be a metaphor for like looking at the big picture, really. So in the long run, yeah. So
perfect. Well, we'll have to have you on to talk more. I know, like I said, we only got to the quad and hamstrings today.
Yeah.
There's so much more to unpack. So we'll have to have you on again soon. But this was really good. So thank you, Josh. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks, Brad.
3, 2, 1.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in learning more about incorporating the lever system into your training, follow us on Instagram @Lever Movement, or even follow me on Strava to learn how I incorporate lever into my training for ultras. Until next time, keep running.